The Brazilian gamble. Why South America is betting on China's C919 aircraft. The global aviation industry is witnessing a seismic shift that few saw coming just a decade ago. In the corridors of power at Boeing's Seattle headquarters and Airbus's sprawling facilities in Toulouse, executives are confronting an uncomfortable reality. Their century-long duopoly over commercial aviation is being challenged, not just threatened, but actively dismantled by an emerging competitor from the East. The story begins in Brazil, a nation that has long been a loyal customer of Western aviation giants. Total Airlines, a Brazilian carrier that built its entire fleet around Boeing and Airbus aircraft, recently made headlines with an announcement that sent shockwaves through the industry. The airline revealed plans to acquire 4 C919 aircraft from China's state-owned Commercial Aircraft Corporation of China, known as COMAC. The deal, valued at approximately $360 million, represents far more than a simple transaction between buyer and seller. This isn't just about 4 airplanes. This is about the fracturing of a market structure that has remained essentially unchanged since the jet age began. For the first time in aviation history, a South American airline is seriously considering purchasing large passenger aircraft designed and manufactured in China. If finalized, Total Airlines would become the first carrier outside the Asian continent to operate COMAC's flagship commercial jet. The journey toward this moment has been months in the making. According to industry sources, Total Airlines and COMAC representatives have been locked in negotiations since early this year, carefully navigating the complex landscape of international aircraft sales, financing arrangements, and regulatory compliance. The Brazilian airline has indicated plans to send a delegation to COMAC's manufacturing facilities in China within the coming weeks to finalize the specifics of their procurement strategy. What makes this development particularly striking is Total Airlines' candid admission about why they're turning to China. In statements to the press, company officials acknowledged they had no choice but to explore alternatives to Boeing and Airbus. This wasn't a casual pivot born from curiosity. It was a decision forced by circumstances that have fundamentally reshaped the global aviation marketplace. To understand how we arrived at this watershed moment, we need to examine the dramatic fall from grace experienced by one of America's most iconic corporations, the Boeing Company. For more than a century, Boeing has been synonymous with aviation excellence. Founded in 1916, the company pioneered countless innovations that made modern air travel possible. From the legendary 747 jumbo jet that revolutionized long-distance flight in the 1970s to the fuel-efficient 787 Dreamliner of the 21st century, Boeing's engineering prowess seemed unassailable. The company's reputation for safety and reliability was the gold standard against which all other manufacturers were measured. Then came 2018, and everything changed. In October of that year, Lion Air Flight 610 plunged into the Java Sea shortly after takeoff from Jakarta, killing all 189 people aboard. The aircraft was a Boeing 737 MAX 8, the newest iteration of Boeing's best-selling narrow-body jet. Investigators eventually determined that a flawed automated flight control system called MCAS, Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, had forced the plane's nose down repeatedly, overwhelming the pilot's attempts to maintain control. Before the full implications of that crash could be absorbed, tragedy struck again. In March 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, another 737 MAX 8, crashed 6 minutes after departure from Addis Ababa, claiming 157 lives. The parallels to the Lion Air disaster were impossible to ignore. Within days, aviation authorities worldwide grounded the entire 737 MAX fleet, an unprecedented action affecting nearly 400 aircraft. The grounding lasted almost 2 years. During that time, Boeing hemorrhaged money, reputation, and credibility. Internal documents revealed that company engineers had identified problems with the MCAS system but failed to adequately communicate these issues to regulators or customers. Congressional investigations exposed a corporate culture that prioritized production schedules and cost-cutting over safety, a devastating revelation for a company whose very identity rested on engineering excellence. When the 737 MAX finally returned to service in January 2023, many industry observers hoped Boeing had turned a corner. The aircraft had undergone extensive modifications, pilot training programs had been enhanced, and the company pledged a renewed commitment to safety. Perhaps finally, Boeing could begin rebuilding trust. That optimism proved tragically premature. January 2024 brought fresh nightmares. An Alaska Airlines 737 MAX 9 was climbing through 16,000 feet shortly after departing Portland, Oregon, when a door plug, a panel that fills an optional emergency exit, explosively separated from the fuselage. Passengers found themselves staring into the night sky through a gaping hole in the aircraft's side. Miraculously, no one was seriously injured, but the incident triggered another round of groundings, investigations, and, honestly, just devastating headlines. This wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout 2024, Boeing faced a cascade of quality control failures, engines catching fire, wheels falling off during landing, hydraulic fluid leaks, and countless manufacturing defects discovered during production inspections. Each revelation further eroded confidence in the company's ability to maintain the exacting standards that aviation safety demands. The numbers tell a grim story. In the first 6 months of 2024, Boeing secured just 156 new aircraft orders, a catastrophic 70% decline compared to the same period the previous year. June proved particularly brutal. Boeing sold merely 14 aircraft that month compared to 304 orders in June of the preceding year. That represents a 95% collapse in monthly sales, a figure that would be unthinkable for a company of Boeing's stature under normal circumstances. But these circumstances are far from normal. Boeing's crisis created an opening that many assumed would be filled entirely by its European rival. Airbus, the Toulouse-based consortium formed in 1970 to challenge American aerospace dominance, seemed positioned to capitalize magnificently on Boeing's misfortunes, and capitalize they did, at least initially. In 2023, Airbus recorded an extraordinary 2,094 new aircraft orders, shattering their previous record of 1,503 set in 2013. The company successfully delivered 735 aircraft to customers that year, exceeding their ambitious target of 720 deliveries. To accommodate surging demand, Airbus announced plans to ramp up monthly production to 75 aircraft, an aggressive expansion considering overall global market demand hovers around 120 aircraft per month. Airbus's strategy was transparent. Capture as much market share as possible, while Boeing struggled with self-inflicted wounds. If they could dominate the narrow-body market segment where both companies compete most directly, they could potentially achieve a decisive, perhaps permanent advantage over their American competitor. There was just one problem. Airbus couldn't build planes fast enough. Despite operating 10 assembly lines scattered across Europe, Asia, and North America, Airbus found itself constrained by the same global supply chain disruptions affecting every major manufacturer. The COVID-19 pandemic had devastated aerospace suppliers, many of which went bankrupt or drastically reduced capacity. The companies that survived faced shortages of skilled labor, raw materials, and critical components. Engine manufacturers struggled to keep pace with demand. The entire industry ecosystem was strained beyond its limits. These constraints created absurd situations. Airlines desperate to expand their fleets found themselves waiting years for aircraft deliveries. Some carriers that had placed orders as far back as 2019 were still waiting in 2024. The backlog grew so severe that Airbus was forced to turn away new customers in certain market segments. Brazil experienced this frustration firsthand. When Brazilian carriers approached Airbus seeking new aircraft to meet growing domestic travel demand, they encountered delivery timelines stretching 5, 6, even 7 years into the future. For airlines operating in a competitive, fast-moving market, such delays were simply unacceptable. Routes needed to be opened, aging aircraft needed replacement, and passengers needed transportation, all on timelines measured in months, not years. This is where China's C919 enters the story. It's worth noting that Brazil possesses its own aircraft manufacturing capabilities through Embraer, a highly respected company that ranks among the world's leading producers of regional jets. Embraer's aircraft, particularly in the 70 to 150 seat category, are renowned for their efficiency and reliability. However, Embraer has historically avoided the large mainline passenger aircraft market, planes with more than 150 seats, where Boeing and Airbus compete most intensely. This strategic decision was largely driven by the immense capital requirements and competitive pressures that dominate the wide-body and large narrow-body segments. Consequently, when Brazilian airlines need aircraft larger than what Embraer produces, they must turn to foreign manufacturers. For decades, that meant Boeing or Airbus. There were no other options, until now. In September 2024, Brazilian media outlets broke the story that Total Aviation, a relatively small cargo and charter operator, was negotiating to purchase 4 C919 aircraft from COMAC. The initial price tag was reported at $360 million, working out to $90 million per aircraft. On its face, this seems like a modest deal. 4 planes from a small Brazilian operator hardly registers compared to the hundreds of aircraft ordered annually by major global carriers. But the symbolic importance of this transaction cannot be overstated. This represents the first instance of any South American airline expressing serious commercial interest in a large passenger aircraft manufactured in China. More significantly, if consummated, Total Aviation would become the first airline anywhere outside Asia to actually purchase and operate COMAC aircraft. This would mark China's true emergence as a global player in commercial aviation, a sector the West has dominated since its inception. When asked why they were considering Chinese aircraft, Total Aviation's response was remarkably straightforward. COMAC committed to delivering the aircraft by March of next year. That simple statement encapsulates the current state of the global aviation market. Speed of delivery, the ability to actually get aircraft into service when airlines need them, has become as important as price, technology, or brand reputation. This urgency explains why Brazil, despite being geographically and culturally distant from China, is potentially beating several Asian nations to become COMAC's first non-Asian customer. Airlines in Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, and other Asian countries have expressed interest in the C919 for years. Some have signed non-binding letters of intent, but none have closed an actual deal. Total Aviation might be first across the finish line not because they were first in line, but because their need was most pressing and COMAC's delivery timeline aligned with that need. The negotiations between Total Aviation and COMAC have been complex, involving far more than simply agreeing on an aircraft price. According to sources familiar with the discussions, the deal includes a sophisticated financing package that could cover up to 80% of the purchase price. This financing would reportedly come through the China Development Bank, one of China's 3 policy banks that specializes in funding infrastructure and development projects, both domestically and internationally. The proposed loan terms are equally attractive, 10 to 12 years for repayment, almost certainly at interest rates significantly below commercial market levels. For a smaller airline like Total Aviation, this financing structure transforms an expensive capital acquisition into a manageable long-term investment. The airline gets the aircraft it needs immediately while spreading the financial burden across more than a decade. This approach, combining competitive aircraft pricing with favorable financing, has become a hallmark of China's international trade strategy across numerous sectors. In aviation, it creates a compelling value proposition that extends far beyond the sticker price of the aircraft itself. Speaking of price, the C919's reported $90 million cost per unit offers meaningful savings compared to Western alternatives. The Boeing 737 MAX and Airbus A320neo, the closest Western competitors to the C919, typically cost between $110 million and $135 million, depending on specific configuration and customization. That means the C919 could save total aviation $20 to $45 million per aircraft, or $80 to $180 million across their four-plane order. For smaller airlines operating on thin margins in competitive markets, these savings are transformative. They could mean the difference between expanding service or maintaining the status quo, between profitability and losses, between survival and bankruptcy. But the Brazil-COMAC deal represents something larger than one airline's purchasing decision. It signals a fundamental shift in how developing nations approach major infrastructure investments. For decades, countries across Africa, Latin America, and Asia had, really limited choices when it came to large-scale technology acquisitions. Want telecommunications infrastructure? Choose between a handful of Western suppliers. Need power generation equipment? Same limited menu. Building an aviation fleet? Boeing or Airbus, take your pick. This monopolistic or duopolistic market structure meant that developing countries often paid premium prices for technology while having minimal negotiating leverage. If Boeing and Airbus both quoted long delivery times and high prices, airlines had no alternative but to accept those terms or forego fleet expansion entirely. The emergence of Chinese alternatives, not just in aviation but across multiple technology sectors, fundamentally changes this dynamic. Suddenly, developing nations have options. They can negotiate more aggressively with Western suppliers by pointing to Chinese alternatives. They can diversify their supplier base to avoid dependency on any single source. They can select solutions that better fit their specific economic circumstances and operational requirements. This newfound leverage explains why the C919 matters far beyond its technical specifications or current market share. It represents the breaking of a decades-old monopoly, the opening of a market that many assumed would remain closed indefinitely. Since its inaugural commercial flight on May 28, 2023, the C919 has compiled an impressive operational record. In just over a year of commercial service, these aircraft have accumulated more than 10,000 flight hours across nearly 3,700 commercial flights, transporting over 500,000 passengers. These aren't test flights or demonstration missions. These are regular scheduled services carrying paying passengers, exactly the same mission profile as any Boeing or Airbus aircraft. Crucially, this operational experience has occurred without any major safety incidents. No crashes, no emergency landings due to mechanical failures, no catastrophic system malfunctions. For a brand new aircraft from a first-time large commercial aircraft manufacturer, this safety record is genuinely remarkable. It suggests that COMAC successfully learned from the decades of experience accumulated by Western manufacturers and applied those lessons to create a fundamentally sound aircraft. The safety performance matters enormously because it directly addresses the primary concern any airline would have when considering an aircraft from a new manufacturer. Is it safe? Can we trust our passengers' lives to this machine? The C919's operational history is beginning to provide reassuring answers to those questions. The aircraft benefits from decades of Chinese industrial policy specifically designed to build aerospace manufacturing capabilities. China didn't wake up one day and decide to build passenger jets. This was a calculated, long-term strategy involving massive government investment in research and development, training thousands of aerospace engineers, building specialized manufacturing facilities, and creating supply chains for thousands of aircraft components. That said, COMAC faces significant challenges in its quest to become a true competitor to Boeing and Airbus on the global stage. The most critical obstacle is airworthiness certification. The regulatory approval that confirms an aircraft meets safety standards and can legally operate in a given jurisdiction. The C919 currently holds airworthiness certification from China's Civil Aviation Administration. This allows it to operate throughout Chinese airspace and serve Chinese airlines, which alone represents an enormous market opportunity. However, the aircraft has not yet secured certification from the European Union Aviation Safety Agency or the United States Federal Aviation Administration, the two regulatory bodies whose approvals are essentially mandatory for any aircraft seeking to compete globally. This lack of Western certification severely limits the C919's international route potential. Even if a European or South American airline wanted to purchase the aircraft, they couldn't operate it on routes entering European or American airspace without appropriate certifications. This creates a chicken and egg problem. Airlines hesitate to order aircraft with limited route flexibility, but regulatory agencies move slowly on certifications without seeing strong market demand. Interestingly, Brazil's Aviation Authority, ANAC, has stated they have not yet received an airworthiness certification application from COMAC for the C919. This means Total Aviation's potential purchase would require navigating complex regulatory terrain, possibly operating the aircraft only on domestic Brazilian routes or international routes, avoiding jurisdictions that require EASA or FAA certification. For the C919 to truly challenge Boeing and Airbus globally, European and American certifications are non-negotiable. Without them, COMAC will remain a regional player serving primarily the Chinese domestic market and perhaps a few other Asian countries willing to accept Chinese certification. Some industry observers speculate that Western regulatory reluctance stems partly from competitive concerns, that approving the C919 would be handing a powerful weapon to companies that Boeing and Airbus view as existential threats. While such political considerations undoubtedly exist, it's worth noting that both EASA and the FAA have strong institutional cultures prioritizing safety above commercial considerations. These agencies certified Russian aircraft during the Cold War and certified Chinese-manufactured components for decades. They're unlikely to block a genuinely safe aircraft purely for competitive reasons. However, there are encouraging signs. The European Union Aviation Safety Agency has actively engaged with COMAC on C919 certification. EASA officials recently visited Shanghai to inspect manufacturing facilities and review documentation, a significant step in the certification process. Following these inspections, EASA representatives reportedly expressed positive assessments of COMAC's quality control systems and manufacturing standards. Many industry analysts interpret this engagement as suggesting EASA certification may eventually be granted, particularly if the C919 continues demonstrating strong safety performance in commercial service. European approval would be a watershed moment, instantly making the aircraft viable for a vast swath of global routes and airlines. The Brazilian deal, if consummated successfully, could accelerate Western certification efforts. Demonstrating market demand from outside Asia, from an airline in a sophisticated aviation market like Brazil, would send a powerful signal that the C919 is a serious commercial product, not merely a government-subsidized prestige project. Strong operational performance in South American service would provide additional safety data for regulators to evaluate. Once certified in Europe and potentially the United States, the C919's competitive position would transform dramatically. Instead of being limited to the Chinese market and a handful of Asian customers, COMAC could genuinely compete for orders from airlines worldwide. Given the current delivery constraints at Airbus and ongoing reputational challenges at Boeing, there would almost certainly be substantial demand. Western media coverage of China's commercial aviation ambitions has often carried a skeptical tone. Headlines frequently frame the C919 as China attempting to break into or challenging the Western-dominated passenger aircraft market, with implicit assumptions that such efforts will ultimately fail or remain marginal. Yet Boeing's own market forecasts suggest a very different future. The company's 2024 Civil Aviation Market Outlook report, released in August, projects enormous growth in Chinese aviation over the next 2 decades. Boeing forecasts China's commercial aircraft fleet will expand at an annual growth rate of 4.1% through 2043. By that year, China's fleet will more than double from current levels, becoming the world's largest operator of wide-body aircraft. To support this growth, Boeing estimates China will require approximately 1,575 new wide-body aircraft over the next 20 years. In the narrow-body segment, where the C919 competes, Chinese demand is expected to account for more than 3/4 of global deliveries in certain years. Think about what this means. Boeing, the American company most threatened by COMAC's emergence, is itself forecasting a Chinese aviation market so large that it could potentially support a major domestic aircraft manufacturer alongside continued imports of Western aircraft. The market opportunity is so vast that there may be room for everyone if COMAC can execute its strategy successfully. This brings us to a fascinating paradox. The same Boeing executives who worry about Chinese competition are simultaneously counting on Chinese market growth to drive their own future revenues. They need China to succeed economically because Chinese airlines buying Boeing aircraft represent a crucial growth market. Yet that same Chinese economic success provides the resources and market foundation for COMAC to develop into a serious competitor. For airlines worldwide, particularly in the developing world, the emergence of the C919 as a viable alternative to Boeing and Airbus represents an unambiguous positive development. Competition drives innovation, keeps prices reasonable, and gives customers leverage in negotiations.